Have you ever heard of Russia's secret or closed cities? The name alone sounds like something out of a spy or science fiction movie, right? But believe me, these places are not a figment of the imagination. In Russia, these cities really did exist, and in some cases still do. Created at the height of the Soviet Union, amidst paranoia and absolute secrecy, they didn't appear on maps, and only the chosen ones could even get close. But what led to the emergence of these cities? Why were they so hidden? And what happened after the Soviet Union collapsed? Today, Bello Mundo takes you on a fascinating journey into the past and present of these cities, which, for decades, remained invisible to the world, but held secrets capable of shaping global history. Before we explore these mysterious cities, it's important to understand what these places are and why they are known as closed or secret cities. A closed city is a settlement where strict rules control who can enter, leave, or even live there. To visit them, or even spend the night, you had to have a special permit. These places were not just military bases or top-secret research facilities. They were real strategic centers, designed to operate with greater freedom and space than a conventional base could offer. But it wasn't just clandestine work that defined these cities. Many had a fixed community, families of workers, trusted traders, and other carefully selected residents. Life there was both isolated from the outside world and completely focused on secret objectives. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union created dozens of these closed cities, hiding them not only from maps, but also from conversations and prying eyes. And even after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, several of these cities continue to exist in the post-Soviet states, especially in Russia. Now that you know what defines these places, it's time to travel with us to these enigmatic locations. Number 1. Alamos 16, Sarov. If we're going to start with stories of total secrecy, nothing could be fairer than bringing the legendary Alamos 16 into the loop. This city, which today bears the name of Sarov, is the perfect synonym for the cradle of the Soviet nuclear program. And the scientific chaos was great. It was there that the country's greatest minds worked on the design of the atomic bomb, and later, the hydrogen bomb. On paper, the place didn't exist. It was just a secret postal address where physicists and engineers, such as the famous Andrei Sarov, developed weapons of mass destruction. For decades, the city remained off the map, surrounded by fences and military forces that controlled every access. Residents couldn't even talk about where they lived. You had to have special permission to set foot there. Some called it the Soviet Los Alamos, in reference to the American laboratory. But what happened to this city after the end of the Soviet Union? Not much really changed. The city regained its historic name of Sarov and still has nuclear research laboratories. It remains closed with restricted access, as it is still a strategic hub for the Russian military. What remains of the former top secret are walls, guarded gates, and the aura of a place where the fate of the world was once, literally and dangerously, on the drawing boards of scientists. Number 2. Ozersk, City 40. If the mystery of Alamos 16 is impressive enough, wait until you see Ozersk, also known as the City of 40. One of the cradles of the Soviet nuclear program, and the scene of secrets as dark as they are radioactive. It all began in the 1940s, when the Soviet Union was desperate to produce plutonium and compete in the global arms race. In the Ural Mountains, Ozersk was born, built in record time to house the Mayak nuclear power plant, one of the largest and most secret at the time. And when we say secret, we mean it. The city didn't even exist on maps, and to the outside world, it was as if nobody lived there. But those who lived in Ozersk knew they were playing a dangerous game. Scientists and technicians had what many could only dream of in the Soviet Union: good apartments, access to culture, and quality services. But this privilege came at a very high cost. No one could enter or leave without permission, and living there meant being under constant surveillance. It was a mixture of luxury and prison, where isolation was the price to pay for scientific progress. And what happened when the veil fell with the end of the Soviet Union? The world discovered the scale of the disasters that Ozersk concealed. In 1957, the Mayak plant, located in Ozersk, was the scene of one of the biggest nuclear disasters in history, releasing more radiation than the Chernobyl meltdown. An underground tank containing improperly stored high-level nuclear waste exploded, spreading a cloud of contamination over thousands of square kilometers. But the disaster of 1957 was just the tip of the iceberg. Before that, much of the plant's nuclear waste was dumped directly into the Ticha River. This river was the only source of water for dozens of riverside villages, such as Musliumovo, where residents depended on it for drinking, washing, and bathing. The contamination devastated these communities, spreading disease and suffering for generations. After the accident, dumping in the river officially ceased, but the practice was replaced by something equally frightening. Waste began to be disposed of in lakes near the plant. The most infamous of these is Lake Karachay, which has become known as the most contaminated place on Earth. To give you an idea, this represents between 80 and 90% of the total radiation released by the Chernobyl disaster. Number 3. Magnitogorsk. Magnitogorsk may not be as closed as Arzamas 16 or Ozersk, but that doesn't mean its history is free of secrets and shadows. This city, built at the base of the legendary Magnitnia Iron Mountain, was the beating heart of the Soviet Union's industrial miracle and a symbol of Stalinist propaganda. In the 30s, during Stalin's ambitious 5-year plans, Magnitogorsk emerged from nowhere as the country's largest steel hub. The aim? To supply the Soviet war machine and turn the city into a living example of socialist industrial power. But the reality was not as glorious as the posters advertised. The workers faced brutal conditions, operating under extreme temperatures and in the midst of suffocating pollution, all to keep the gigantic furnaces of the MMK plant running. During the Second World War and the most tense periods of the Cold War, the city became a key part of Soviet military strategy, producing steel for tanks, planes, and other war machines. So it's no surprise that the city was restricted to foreigners, shrouded in an aura of mystery that kept it off the international radar. And what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union? Like the country itself, the place suffered. The economic crisis of the 90s hit its factories hard, exposing decades of technological lag. But the MMK plant, a true industrial giant, survived and continues to operate on a large scale. Today, the city is trying to modernize, but the legacy of its past cannot be ignored. It is no longer secretive in the strict sense, but it carries the weight of a past of aggressive urban planning, intense pollution, and a working-class culture shaped by sacrifice. Number 4. Zheleznogorsk, Krasnoyarsk 26. Moving on, our next stop takes us deep into Siberia, where we find Zheleznogorsk, formerly known as Krasnoyarsk 26. This city is the perfect example of being off the map. Literally, it didn't appear anywhere, and to the outside world, it simply didn't exist. Strategically located on the banks of the Yenisei River, Zheleznogorsk was founded in the 1950s, at the height of the Cold War nuclear race. Its mission? To produce plutonium for nuclear weapons. And like any other strategic hub of the time, Everything there was shrouded in mystery and absolute secrecy. The residents lived under constant surveillance. It was impossible to enter or leave Zheleznogorsk without permission. In the post-Soviet period, Russia had to rethink its nuclear industry. Some of the reactors were decommissioned, others were adapted to generate civilian energy. The only thing that hasn't changed is its closed status. Even today, however, Zheleznogorsk remains under strict access control. The process of opening the city to visitors is slow and full of restrictions. Number 5. Seversk, Tomsk 7. When it comes to nuclear research, Seversk, which used to be called Tomsk City, is second to none. Close to the city of Tomsk in western Siberia, it sprang up in the 50s like so many other atomic sites, surrounded by walls with restricted access and responsible for producing fissile material for bombs and reactors. During the Soviet era, this city simply didn't exist for the world. It didn't appear on maps, and mentioning what happened there was forbidden. It was only in 1992, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the city received an official name and was publicly recognized. But don't think that this means easy access. Even today, entering here requires special permits, and the residents remain under constant surveillance. What really marked the history of the place, apart from the mystery surrounding it, was the incident of 1993. A chemical explosion in a highly radioactive waste tank released a significant amount of contamination into the surrounding area. The authorities, as usual, played down the impact, but independent studies revealed dangerous levels of radiation in some nearby areas. Today, Seversk remains an important hub for atomic activities. The city is home to uranium enrichment and nuclear fuel reprocessing facilities, and most of its population depends directly on this sector to survive. Number 6. Lesnoy, Sverdlovsk 45. Located in the Sverdlovsk region, now Yekaterinburg, Lesnoy is another example of a place that was born and raised in the shadow of the nuclear program. Founded in 1947, initially as Sverdlovsk 45, it was essential for the manufacture of atomic bomb components. During the Soviet period, it was heavily guarded, literally shrouded in forest. As its name suggests, Les means forest in Russian. Strict rules prohibited workers from leaving without permits, and those who lived there received supplies directly from the state, as well as benefits such as quality schools and hospitals. And after the fall, what was left? As with all secret cities, President Boris Yeltsin decreed in '92 that such places could use their historical names. However, the city retained its status as a closed site, housing factories responsible for maintaining nuclear warheads and dismantling older weapons. To this day, the population cannot receive tourists without prior authorization, and there are checkpoints guarded by the military, meaning that those who live there rarely talk about what happens inside the walls. Number 7. Snezhinsk, Chelyabinsk 70. If you like cold and secrets, Snezhinsk, or Chelyabinsk 70, as it was known in Soviet times, is the perfect place to feed your curiosity, at least in your imagination. The name Snezhinsk, inspired by the Russian word for snow, sneg, perfectly matches the icy scenery of the Ural Mountains, where this city was built to be another nuclear science stronghold. Unlike Artemis 16, which was the cradle of the Soviet nuclear project, this city was created to take research to a new level. In the 50s and 60s, the arms race demanded more and more sites like this. The Snezhinsk laboratory not only developed, but also tested new generations of nuclear warheads. It was a place where science and Cold War paranoia went hand in hand. Life in the city, for those who were part of the scientific and technical elite, could even seem comfortable. Good housing, services, and access to resources that many Soviets couldn't even dream of. But the price was high. Residents lived surrounded by checkpoints, isolated from the rest of the world, and with a freedom that existed only within the walls. With the end of the Soviet Union, the municipality ceased to be an absolute secret and even began to collaborate, to a limited extent, with international nuclear non-proliferation programs. Nevertheless, it remains a closed city full of restrictions. Number 8. Norilsk. Norilsk is perhaps the most famous of Russia's secret or semi-secret cities, although its history is not directly linked to the nuclear program. Situated in the far north of Siberia, high above the Arctic Circle, it became one of the largest mining centers for nickel, copper, and palladium, essential resources for Soviet industry. And, like many of the cities on this list, it was out of the reach of foreigners for a long time, maintaining an air of exclusivity and isolation. But what really marks this place out is the brutality of its past. In the 30s and 40s, the city was built and operated by prisoners of the GULAG system, where political prisoners and convicts were sent to build and operate mines under almost unimaginable climatic conditions. Just to give you an idea, temperatures there can plummet to -50 degrees Celsius, while snowstorms sweep across the landscape with relentless force. In other words, for the prisoners, Norilsk was literally a freezing hell. In addition to the extreme cold, there is another nightmare that defines the city: pollution. Norilsk is known as one of the most polluted places in the world, thanks to its gigantic foundries that release tons of pollutants into the atmosphere. The environmental impact is so devastating that the trees around the city died decades ago, and the air contains alarming levels of sulfur dioxide. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Norilsk remained a difficult place to live, but attractive to those seeking relatively high wages in the mines, now controlled by large Russian corporations. Although the city is not completely closed, there are still restrictions on foreigners who need special permits to visit. Number 9. Vilyuchinsk, Petropavlovsk, Kamchatsky 50. Leaving mainland Siberia and heading straight for the far east of Russia, we find Vilyuchinsk, formerly known as Petropavlovsk, Kamchatsky 50. Located on the stunning Kamchatka Peninsula, famous for its active volcanoes and wilderness, this coastal town hides one of the Russian Navy's best-kept secrets: a cluster of naval bases and nuclear submarines. During the Cold War, Krasheninnikov Bay was practically a fortress. Ballistic missile submarines and attack ships docked there under constant surveillance, protected by a high-security military zone. Civilians could only enter with strict permits, and any public mention of Vilyuchinsk was forbidden. For most, what happened there was a mystery shrouded in secrecy and a cold sea. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the city remained strategic, but the military budget was drastically cut. Many of the submarines grew old and were scrapped. Today, it remains one of the main points of Russia's Pacific Fleet, with modernized bases that still keep secrets and ensure that the city remains closed to the public. Number 10. Vladivostok. To close with a golden key or iron gates, let's talk about Vladivostok. Today, the city is a relatively accessible destination, known for its port on the Pacific Ocean and the Ruski Island Bridge, which impresses with its engineering. But it wasn't always like this. For much of the Soviet era, the city was forbidden territory for foreigners and, in many cases, even for Russian citizens from other regions. Why so much secrecy? The answer lies in the sea. Vladivostok was the headquarters of the Soviet Navy's powerful Pacific Fleet, a vital strategic point for the country's defense during the Cold War. Nuclear submarines, destroyers, and warships occupied its ports, and any threat of espionage was treated extremely seriously. As a result, entry for non-residents was almost impossible. Foreigners needed special permits, rare as gold. The city disappeared from tourist maps, even though it was one of the largest urban centers in the region. Everything changed with the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1992, President Boris Yeltsin opened Vladivostok to the world. Since then, the city has undergone a transformation, becoming a vibrant economic and cultural hub. Today, it is a popular destination, attracting travelers on the Trans-Siberian route and Asian tourists who explore its streets full of history. And so ends another journey through the closed and secret world of Russia. If these stories shocked you as much as they did us, you already know what to do. Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and stay tuned for the next videos. Now we want to know, what impressed you most about this dark list? Leave your comment below and let's continue this conversation. Thank you very much for following us to the end. We'll see you on our next journey, uncovering the lesser-known and more intriguing sides of our Bello Mundo. Until then.